The rain hammered against the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists, and the wipers struggled to keep pace, smearing the water in streaks across the glass. Lena had driven this road 100 times before, but tonight, with the storm at its peak and the night inky black, it felt like she was venturing into uncharted territory. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly as she squinted to make out the road ahead, barely visible in the glow of her headlights. She had spent the day chasing down leads for her latest story, a high-profile corruption case that had taken her to the city and back again, leaving her exhausted. The last thing she needed was to be out here in the middle of nowhere, in the midst of a storm that seemed determined to tear the world apart. But there was something about this road, this isolated stretch of highway cutting through the dense woods, that always made her uneasy, even on the calmest of days. It felt alive, as if the trees themselves were watching, waiting for something. Lena shook off the thought, chalking it up to the fatigue gnawing at the edges of her mind. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard. Almost midnight. She'd be home soon, a warm bed just a few more miles away. Just as she began to relax her grip, a flash of movement caught her eye. Her heart lurched as she instinctively slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the wet pavement before coming to a jolting stop. For a moment, there was only the sound of the rain and the rapid thudding of her heartbeat. She stared into the darkness, her breath caught in her throat, straining to see what had caused her to stop. The road ahead was empty, the shadows of the trees looming ominously in the distance. Had it been an animal, a deer, maybe? She leaned forward, peering out into the night, and that's when she saw him. A boy, no older than 8 or 9, standing by the side of the road. His skin was pale, almost ghostly under the dim light, but it was his hair that caught her attention. It was silver like moonlight on fresh snow. The boy stood completely still, his arms limp at his sides, his eyes wide and unblinking as he stared at her car. He was soaked to the bone, his clothes clinging to his small frame, and yet he made no move to shield himself from the rain. Lena hesitated, every instinct telling her to stay in the car, to drive away and leave this strange, unsettling scene behind. But something else, some deeper, almost primal urge, compelled her to act. She couldn't just leave him there, not in this storm, not in the middle of nowhere. What if he was lost? What if he was hurt? Taking a deep breath, she unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed the door open, the rain immediately soaking through her jacket. She approached the boy cautiously, her boots splashing in the puddles as she stepped closer. "Hey," she called out, her voice barely audible over the roar of the rain. "Are you okay?" The boy didn't respond. He didn't move at all, not even a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Lena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain seep into her bones. She was only a few feet away from him now, close enough to see the slight rise and fall of his chest. He was breathing, but just barely. "Where are your parents?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you lost?" Still nothing. The boy just stared at her, his eyes dark and unreadable, as if he was looking right through her. Lena's unease grew, but she couldn't just leave him here. She stepped forward, gently reaching out to touch his shoulder, trying to coax him into the warmth of her car. The moment her hand made contact, the boy's lips parted slightly, and he spoke. Just one word, barely more than a whisper. "Run." Lena froze, her breath catching in her throat. She stared down at the boy, his face now twisted with something that looked almost like fear. But before she could react, before she could even process what he had said, the boy collapsed, crumpling to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut. "Hey! Hey! Stay with me!" Panic surged through her as she dropped to her knees beside him, checking for a pulse. It was there, weak and fluttering, but enough to keep him alive. For now. She needed to get him to a hospital, fast. Without another thought, Lena scooped the boy into her arms. He was lighter than she expected, almost weightless. She hurried back to the car, carefully placing him in the passenger seat. His head lolled to the side, eyes half closed, as she fumbled with her phone, cursing under her breath, when she realized there was no signal out here. "No choice," she muttered to herself, slamming the door shut and starting the engine. She couldn't wait for help to come to them. Not out here, not in this storm. She had to get to town, to the nearest hospital, and hope that whatever was wrong with him wasn't too late to fix. As she drove, the boy murmured something again, his voice barely audible over the engine. Lena leaned in closer, trying to make out the words. "What did you say?" His eyes fluttered open, just for a moment, and he looked at her with an expression that sent a shiver down her spine. "He's coming." Lena's blood ran cold. "Who's coming? What are you talking about?" But the boy had already slipped back into unconsciousness, leaving her with nothing but the sound of the rain and the gnawing dread that was rapidly consuming her. She pressed her foot harder on the gas pedal, the car speeding through the storm, as the feeling of being watched settled heavily on her shoulders. The road stretched out before her, long and empty. But in the rearview mirror, something moved, something large, something that shouldn't be there. The trees seemed to shudder as a shadow passed through them, gaining on the car with unnatural speed. Lena's hands tightened on the wheel, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't dare look back again. She just drove, faster and faster, as the storm raged around her and the darkness closed in. This was supposed to be just another late-night drive home, but now it felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. And the boy beside her, this strange, silent boy with silver hair, was at the center of it all. Who was he? What had he seen? And what terrible thing was following them? The answers, Lena feared, were waiting for her just up ahead. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital waiting room did little to dispel the unease gnawing at Lena's stomach. She sat stiffly in the plastic chair, her eyes darting to the clock on the wall, counting the minutes since the doctors had whisked the boy away. The rain had finally let up, but the storm clouds still loomed heavy over the town, casting everything in a dull, gray light. The boy's strange, whispered warnings played on a loop in her mind, feeding her growing sense of dread. Run! He's coming! And then that last, terrifying glance into the rearview mirror. What had she seen? What had been out there on that dark road? Lena wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but the fear in the boy's eyes had been real. Whatever, or whoever was coming, he was terrified of it. She shook her head, trying to dispel the thoughts. Focus, she told herself. The boy was safe now, under medical care. But who was he? Where had he come from, and why had he been alone on that deserted road in the middle of the night? Her musings were interrupted by the arrival of Detective Samuel Harris, a grizzled, no-nonsense cop with salt and pepper hair and a perpetual frown etched into his face. He approached her with a deliberate slowness, as if he were carefully considering every step. "Miss Weaver?" he asked, his voice gravelly from years of barking orders and asking hard questions. Lena stood, extending a hand. "Yes, that's me. Detective Harris, right?" He shook her hand briefly, then gestured for her to sit. "I understand you found the boy on the roadside and brought him here. We appreciate you doing that. It's the kind of thing a lot of people would have driven right past." Lena nodded, trying to read the detective's expression. His face was impassive, but there was something in his eyes, an edge, as if he were holding back. "How is he?" she asked, needing to know that the boy was okay. "He's stable but unresponsive," Harris said, folding his arms. "Doctors are running tests, but so far nothing unusual physically, just exhaustion and dehydration. Mentally, though, well, they're not sure yet. He hasn't spoken a word since he arrived." Lena felt a wave of relief, mixed with frustration. The boy was alive, but that didn't bring her any closer to understanding what had happened. "Has he been identified?" Harris shook his head. "No ID on him. No match in any missing persons database. We're working on getting his fingerprints processed, but so far, nothing. It's like he doesn't exist." "Doesn't exist?" Lena repeated, the words leaving a bitter taste in her mouth. "Someone must be looking for him. A kid like that doesn't just appear out of nowhere. That's what we're trying to figure out." Harris leaned in slightly, his gaze locking onto hers. "You said in your statement that the boy mentioned something about someone coming. Can you tell me exactly what he said?" Lena hesitated, the memory of the boy's voice sending a shiver down her spine. "He said he's coming. That's all. I tried to ask him more, but he passed out before he could explain." The detective frowned, tapping a finger against his chin. "And did you see anything unusual on your way here? Anything or anyone that might explain who or what he was talking about?" Lena thought back to that moment, the dark shape she had glimpsed in the mirror. It had been so fleeting, so quick, she wasn't even sure what she'd seen. "I'm not sure. There was something, maybe. A shadow, but it was probably just the storm playing tricks on my eyes." Harris's expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of interest in his eyes. "This isn't the first case we've had recently of people seeing things that can't be explained. You wouldn't be alone in that." Lena's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The detective glanced around the waiting room, making sure they weren't being overheard, before leaning in closer. "There have been incidents, disappearances, people reporting strange figures, sounds in the woods, things that don't add up. And every time it's like the people involved just vanish, without a trace. We're talking about upstanding citizens, families, not the kind of people who just pick up and leave." Lena felt a chill run down her spine. "And you think this boy is connected to that?" Harris sighed, rubbing his temples. "I don't know, but something doesn't feel right about this case. My gut's telling me that whatever happened to that boy, it's just the tip of the iceberg." Lena's journalistic instincts kicked in. Her curiosity piqued despite the fear gnawing at her. "I want to help. Let me look into this. I have resources, contacts. Maybe I can dig up something you've missed." The detective hesitated, clearly torn. I can't officially ask you to get involved, Miss Weaver. This could be dangerous. Then don't ask me officially, Lena said, her voice firm. You know I'll find a way to investigate this on my own, with or without your blessing. Harris studied her for a long moment, then finally nodded. All right, but keep me in the loop. If you find anything at all, you come straight to me. Deal, Lena agreed, feeling a rush of determination. She was going to get to the bottom of this no matter what it took. As Harris stood to leave, he paused, looking over his shoulder at her. One more thing. Don't go near that boy alone. There's something off about him. And until we know what we're dealing with, it's better to be cautious. Lena nodded, but as soon as the detective walked away, she felt the familiar tug of curiosity pulling her back toward the boys' room. Harris's warning echoed in her mind, but she pushed it aside. She needed to see him again, to see if she could coax any more information out of him. Information that might explain the strange sense of dread that had settled over her since the moment she found him. She made her way down the sterile hospital corridor, her footsteps echoing softly off the linoleum floor. When she reached the door to the boys' room, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She wasn't sure what she was expecting to find on the other side, but the sense of foreboding was stronger than ever. Taking a deep breath, Lena pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn tight against the stormy sky outside. The boy lay on the bed, motionless, his silver hair splayed out on the pillow like a halo. His face was pale, almost ethereal, and for a moment Lena wondered if he was even breathing. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of danger, but there was nothing out of the ordinary, just the quiet hum of medical equipment and the soft beep of the heart monitor. The boy's chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, though his expression remained vacant, as if he were lost in a world of his own. Lena reached out hesitantly, her fingers lightly brushing his hand. It was cold to the touch, but as soon as she made contact, the boy's eyes snapped open. They locked onto hers with an intensity that took her breath away. "Who is he?" Lena whispered, half to herself, half in a desperate plea for the boy to respond. For a long moment there was nothing, just the silence of the room and the weight of those unblinking eyes. And then, slowly, the boy's lips began to move, forming words so faint that Lena had to lean in to hear them. "He's here," the boy murmured, his voice barely more than a breath. "He's coming." Lena's heart pounded in her chest. Who's coming? But the boy said nothing more. His eyes drifted closed once again, leaving Lena standing there, her mind racing with 1,000 questions and no answers. She stepped back, her hand trembling slightly as she let go of his. This was no ordinary child. Of that she was certain. And whatever he was afraid of, whatever had been following them that night, was something far beyond her understanding. Lena left the room quietly, her mind already spinning with the details of her next steps. She needed to find out more about the boy, about the disappearances Harris had mentioned, and about the strange occurrences that seemed to plague this town. As she walked out of the hospital, the rain had stopped, leaving the air thick and heavy with the scent of wet earth. The storm had passed, but Lena knew that the real danger was only just beginning. She had stumbled onto something dark, something ancient, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the boy was just the beginning of it. Whatever secrets lay buried in this town, she was determined to uncover them, no matter the cost. The light drizzle that had begun shortly after Lena left the hospital had now turned into a persistent, cold rain, matching the bleakness she felt deep in her gut. She drove slowly through the narrow streets of the small town, her thoughts racing as she tried to piece together the fragments of information she had gathered. The boy's chilling words, Detective Harris's cryptic warnings, and the strange, unnatural fear that had gripped her since that night all pointed to something far more sinister than a simple missing child case. The town of Black Hollow, with its quiet streets and quaint charm, held a dark secret. Lena could feel it in the way the townspeople glanced at her, their eyes filled with a mix of suspicion and fear as she passed by. She could sense it in the heavy silence that hung over the town, a silence that seemed to seep into her bones, weighing her down with each passing hour. Lena knew where she needed to go next. The abandoned orphanage on the outskirts of town had come up again and again in her research. An orphanage with a dark history that no one seemed willing to talk about. The place had been shuttered for decades, but the whispers surrounding it had never truly died. There were stories of brutal caretakers, of children who had vanished without a trace, and of strange rituals conducted in the dead of night. The name Dr. Mirov had surfaced in the town's faded records, always linked to the orphanage and always mentioned in hushed tones. It didn't take Lena long to reach the orphanage. The narrow road leading to it was overgrown with weeds and flanked by towering trees that seemed to close in around her as she drove. The further she went, the more isolated she felt, as if she were being drawn into another world entirely, one where the rules of reality no longer applied. The orphanage loomed ahead, a crumbling relic of a bygone era. The building was massive, its once grand facade now a decaying shell, with ivy crawling up its walls and shattered windows staring out like hollow eyes. The iron gates at the entrance were rusted and bent, hanging askew on their hinges, as if the very land itself had tried to push them aside. Lena parked her car just outside the gates and sat for a moment, staring at the structure in silence. She wasn't sure what she expected to find inside, but she knew she had to go in. Something or someone had left that boy on the roadside, and Lena was certain the answers lay within these walls. She grabbed her flashlight and a notebook from the passenger seat, then stepped out of the car, the rain immediately soaking through her coat. She pulled her collar up against the chill and made her way to the gates. Pushing them open with a loud creak, she hesitated for a moment before stepping onto the cracked stone path that led to the front doors. The air felt heavier here, as if the orphanage itself were holding its breath, waiting for her to make the first move. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and then walked up the steps to the entrance. The door was unlocked, hanging slightly ajar, as if inviting her inside. Lena pushed it open cautiously, the hinges groaning in protest. The interior was just as decayed as the exterior, peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and the lingering scent of mold and decay. But there was something else, too, something faint and almost imperceptible, like the echo of a distant memory. It was a smell she couldn't quite place, something acrid and metallic that set her nerves on edge. She shone her flashlight around the foyer, the beam cutting through the darkness and revealing the remnants of a life long forgotten. Old toys lay scattered across the floor, their colors faded and their edges worn smooth by time. A dusty painting hung crooked on the wall, its image obscured by grime. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she took it all in, the weight of the place pressing down on her like a physical force. The stairs at the far end of the foyer led up to the second floor, where the dormitories had once been. But it was the basement that drew her attention, the heavy wooden door at the back of the hall that seemed out of place in its sturdiness. It was as if the door had been built to keep something inside, something that should never have been let out. Lena approached the door slowly, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The closer she got, the stronger that strange metallic scent became. She hesitated for a moment, then reached out and grasped the cold iron handle. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into the darkness. She descended carefully, each step feeling like it could be her last. The air grew colder as she went deeper, the darkness swallowing the light from her flashlight and leaving only a dim glow to guide her. The walls were lined with old pipes and exposed wires, and the floor was slick with moisture, making her steps treacherous. But Lena pressed on, driven by a need to uncover the truth, no matter how horrifying it might be. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement opened up into a large, cavernous room. The ceiling was low, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with old, rusted medical equipment, scalpels, syringes, jars filled with unidentifiable substances. In the center of the room stood a large metal table, its surface stained with dark, dried blood. Chains hung from the ceiling above the table, and Lena felt her stomach turn as she realized what they were for. But it was the far corner of the room that truly caught her attention. There, tucked away in the shadows, was a small wooden door, nearly hidden behind a stack of old crates. It was smaller than the others, almost child-sized, and it sent a shiver down her spine. She approached it cautiously, her breath catching in her throat as she reached out to open it. The door creaked open to reveal a tiny, cramped room, barely large enough for a single person to stand in. The walls were lined with crumbling brick, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. But it was what lay on the floor that made Lena's blood run cold. A small, leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed with age, and its cover cracked and worn. Lena picked up the diary carefully, her hands trembling slightly. She flipped it open, the pages brittle under her fingers. The handwriting was neat and precise, the ink faded but still legible. The name on the inside cover sent a chill down her spine, Dr. Viktor Mirov. She began to read, the words on the page revealing a story more horrifying than she could have ever imagined. The diary detailed Mirov's experiments, his twisted obsession with finding the secret to eternal youth. He had used the children in the orphanage as his subjects, conducting gruesome and inhumane procedures in an attempt to transfer their life force into himself. The children with silver hair were particularly prized, believed to possess a unique energy that Mirov believed could grant him immortality. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she read on, the horror of what had happened in this place washing over her in waves. The children hadn't just died, they had been sacrificed, their lives drained away in a perverse ritual that left their bodies cold and lifeless, their souls trapped in a limbo between life and death. The boy she had found, he was one of them, Lena realized with a sinking feeling in her gut. He had escaped somehow, but he was still connected to this place, still tied to the darkness that had consumed so many others. And now, whatever force Mirov had unleashed was coming for him. A sudden noise behind her snapped Lena out of her thoughts. She spun around, her flashlight beam sweeping across the room, but there was nothing there, only the oppressive silence and the lingering scent of death. Her heart raced and she felt the walls closing in around her, the darkness threatening to swallow her whole. She had to get out of here. She had to warn Harris, to tell him what she had found. But as she turned to leave, the small door slammed shut behind her, plunging the room into darkness. Lena's breath caught in her throat, her mind racing as she fumbled for the door handle. It wouldn't budge. The door was locked. Panic surged through her, and she pounded on the door with her fists, her voice echoing in the tiny room. "Help! Let me out!" But there was no response, only the sound of her own breathing, ragged and desperate. She was trapped, alone in the dark, with only the diary and the remnants of Mirov's madness for company. Lena sank to the floor, her back against the cold brick wall, as the reality of her situation set in. She had come here seeking answers, but all she had found was more horror, more questions, and now she was part of it, caught in the web of evil that Mirov had spun so many years ago. She closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that threatened to overwhelm her. She had to stay strong, had to find a way out of this. There had to be a way to escape, to stop whatever was coming before it was too late. But deep down, Lena knew that the past had already caught up with her. The darkness that had claimed so many lives here wasn't finished yet, and now it had her in its grip. As she sat there, the silence around her thick and suffocating, Lena felt a cold breath on the back of her neck. Her eyes snapped open, her heart pounding in her chest, but there was nothing there. Only the darkness and the growing sense of dread that told her she wasn't alone. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, twisting and writhing as if they had a life of their own. And then, just at the edge of her vision, she saw it. A figure, small and pale, with hair as silver as moonlight, standing silently in the corner of the room. The boy. But this time he wasn't alone. Lena's blood ran cold as she realized what she was seeing. The other children, the ones who had been sacrificed, were there too, watching her with hollow eyes, their faces twisted with anger and sorrow. They were trapped just like she was, caught in the same nightmare that had claimed them all those years ago. And now they wanted her to join them. Lena scrambled to her feet, her heart racing as she backed away from the figures, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But there was nowhere to go, no way out. The door remained locked, the darkness pressing in around her, and the children were getting closer, their cold, dead eyes fixed on her. She could feel their pain, their anger, their desperation. They were the victims of Mirov's madness, their lives stolen from them in the name of his twisted pursuit of immortality. And now they were trapped in this place, doomed to relive their suffering for eternity. But Lena wasn't ready to give up. She had come here for answers, and she wasn't going to let the darkness claim her without a fight. She had to find a way to break the cycle, to free the children from the grip of this evil place. Drawing on every ounce of courage she had left, Lena took a deep breath and faced the children, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said softly, hoping they could understand. "I'm going to help you. I'm going to make sure Mirov never hurts anyone again." For a moment, the children hesitated, their forms flickering as if caught between worlds. The boy, the one she had found on the roadside, stepped forward, his silver hair glowing faintly in the darkness. He looked at her with those same haunted eyes, and for the first time, Lena saw a flicker of something else, something that looked like hope. But before she could say anything more, the door behind her suddenly burst open, flooding the room with light. Lena spun around, blinded by the brightness, as Detective Harris stormed into the room, his gun drawn and his face a mask of determination. "Lena, get out of there, now!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the haze of fear. Lena didn't need to be told twice. She bolted for the door, her legs shaking as she stumbled into the hallway, the cool air hitting her like a slap in the face. Harris grabbed her arm, pulling her to safety as the door slammed shut behind them. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavy in the air. Then, slowly, Lena turned to look back at the door, her heart still racing. The room was silent again, the shadows still and lifeless, as if nothing had ever happened. But Lena knew better. She had seen the truth with her own eyes, felt the cold touch of the past reaching out to claim her. The children were still there, trapped in that nightmare, and now she had to find a way to set them free. Harris's voice broke through her thoughts, low and grim. "What the hell did you find down there?" Lena looked up at him, her eyes filled with a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. "The truth, and it's worse than we ever imagined." They had only scratched the surface of the horrors that lay buried in Black Hollow, but now there was no turning back. The past had been unleashed, and it was up to them to stop it, before it consumed them all. The fog rolled in thick and fast, swallowing the town of Black Hollow in a shroud of gloom that mirrored the despair weighing down on Lena's shoulders. She stood by her window, staring out at the mist that clung to the streets like a suffocating blanket. The morning light struggled to break through, casting the world outside in shades of gray. It had been 3 days since her harrowing discovery at the orphanage, and the nightmares hadn't stopped. Each night, as soon as she closed her eyes, she was back in that basement, the shadows creeping in, the faces of the children with their hollow eyes staring at her with a mix of anger and sorrow. But there was something else now, something worse. In the dreams, the boy with the silver hair was no longer a silent, haunting figure. He was speaking to her, his voice a low, eerie whisper that echoed in her mind long after she awoke. "Help us, set us free." Lena knew she couldn't ignore the dreams, but she was terrified of what they might mean. The investigation had taken a toll on her, far more than she had anticipated. It wasn't just the exhaustion from sleepless nights or the gnawing fear that had settled in her gut. It was the growing sense that she was in over her head, that she had uncovered something far more dangerous than she could handle. The boy's words echoed in her mind as she turned away from the window and picked up the old diary she had found in the orphanage. Dr. Mirov's neat handwriting stared back at her from the yellowed pages, chronicling his descent into madness. The doctor had been a man obsessed with power, with the idea of transcending mortality, and he had been willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to achieve it. Lena had read the diary cover to cover, each entry more disturbing than the last. Mirov had believed that the children with silver hair possessed a unique energy, something that could be harnessed through dark rituals to grant him eternal life. The experiments had been brutal, the children's lives drained away in a perverse imitation of science. But something had gone wrong. Mirov's quest for immortality had backfired, trapping the souls of the children in a limbo between life and death, bound to the orphanage and to the ritual that had failed. But there was something else in the diary, something that had been gnawing at Lena ever since she read it. Mirov had written of an ancient power, something far older than the rituals he had performed. He had believed that by binding the children's souls, he could awaken this power, control it. But instead, he had unleashed it, and now it was hunting, searching for the boy, the last of the silver-haired children. The phone rang, startling Lena out of her thoughts. She crossed the room and picked it up, her heart sinking when she saw Detective Harris's name on the caller ID. Lena, Harris's voice was tense, strained. "We need to talk, now." "What happened?" she asked, already fearing the worst. "There's been another death. Your friend, Alex Carter, the one who was helping you with the research, he's dead." Lena felt the blood drain from her face, her grip on the phone tightening. "What?" "No, that's not possible. I just spoke to him yesterday." "I'm sorry, Lena," Harris said, his voice heavy with sympathy. "It looks like a car accident, but something doesn't add up. The way he was found, it doesn't make sense. It's like he swerved off the road deliberately, but there were no skid marks, no sign that he even tried to stop." Lena's mind raced, the pieces falling into place with a sickening clarity. Alex had been helping her dig into the town's history, into the orphanage and Mirov's experiments. He had found something that had gotten him killed. "I'm coming to the station," Lena said, her voice trembling. "We need to figure this out, Harris, before anyone else gets hurt." She hung up and grabbed her coat, her mind spinning as she headed for the door. The rain had started up again, a steady, relentless downpour that soaked through her clothes as soon as she stepped outside. The world seemed smaller, more confined, as if the fog had shrunk it down to just her, the boy, and the growing darkness. By the time Lena reached the police station, her nerves were frayed, the knot of fear in her stomach tightening with every step. Harris was waiting for her in his office, his expression grim as he gestured for her to sit. "I pulled Alex's car from the ravine this morning," Harris said, sitting down across from her. "There was something strange about the crash. The car wasn't damaged the way you'd expect from an impact like that. It's almost like it was pulled off the road." Lena's breath caught in her throat. "Pulled? By what?" Harris leaned forward, his voice low. "I don't know, but I found this in the car." He slid a small, worn photograph across the desk. Lena picked it up, her heart skipping a beat as she recognized the face in the picture. It was the boy. The same boy with the silver hair, standing beside a younger Dr. Mirov in front of the orphanage. But there was something wrong with the photo, something that made Lena's skin crawl. The boy's eyes, they were different, darker, almost black, and filled with a malice that hadn't been there before. "What is this?" Lena whispered, unable to tear her eyes away from the photograph. "It was tucked inside the glove compartment," Harris said. Alex must have found it while he was researching. Maybe it spooked him, or maybe it was something else. But whatever it was, he ended up dead. Lena felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. She knew deep down that the boy was somehow responsible. Not the boy himself, but the thing that had been unleashed, the ancient power Mirov had tried to control. It was using the boy, hunting those who got too close to the truth. "I have to stop this," Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have to find out what Mirov did and how to reverse it." Harris shook his head. "This isn't just some story you can dig your way out of, Lena. Whatever this is, it's dangerous. You've seen what it's capable of." "I know," Lena replied, a steely resolve hardening in her chest. "But if I don't stop it, more people are going to die. This thing, it's using the boy. It's tied to him somehow, and it won't stop until it gets what it wants." "And what does it want?" Harris asked, his voice tinged with fear. Lena stared at the photograph, the boy's dark eyes boring into her own. "I think it wants to finish what Mirov started. It wants to complete the ritual, to bind itself to this world permanently, and to do that, it needs the boy." The detective's face paled, and for the first time, Lena saw genuine fear in his eyes. "Then we need to find the boy. But how? He's still at the hospital, isn't he?" Lena shook her head. "He was, but I checked in with the hospital this morning. They said he disappeared last night, just vanished from his bed. No one saw a thing." Harris cursed under his breath. "If that thing has the boy, then we're running out of time." Lena stood, the photograph still clutched in her hand. "I need to go back to the orphanage. There's something there I missed, something that might help me figure out how to stop this. Maybe the answer is in Mirov's notes, or something in that basement. I have to try." Harris hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "Lena, you don't have to do this alone. Let me come with you." "No," Lena said firmly, though the thought of facing the darkness again terrified her. "You need to stay here. Keep an eye on things in town. If I don't make it back, you need to warn people, get them out of here." Harris looked like he wanted to argue, but he finally nodded. "Be careful, Lena. And if you see anything at all, don't hesitate. Get out of there and call me." Lena nodded, forcing a tight smile. "I will. And Harris, thank you." The detective nodded, his expression grim. "Good luck." As Lena left the station, the rain was coming down harder, the streets almost empty under the deluge. She knew the risks of going back to the orphanage, but she didn't have a choice. The darkness that had been unleashed was growing stronger, and if she didn't stop it, it would consume everything. The drive to the orphanage felt longer this time, the rain-soaked roads winding through the dense forest, the trees pressing in on either side like sentinels guarding a dark secret. Lena's hands gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white as she tried to steady her nerves. She parked outside the gates, the car's headlights barely piercing the thick fog that clung to the ground. The orphanage loomed ahead, its decaying facade even more ominous in the gloom. The memories of her last visit came rushing back, the cold, the darkness, the faces of the children watching her from the shadows. But this time, Lena was prepared. She had brought a small bag with her, filled with supplies, a flashlight, a journal, a recorder, and a small rusted key she had found in the diary, a key that Mirov had written about in one of his last frantic entries. "The key to eternal life lies within," he had written, "but beware the darkness, for it seeks what it has lost." Lena didn't know what she would find inside, but she knew that this key was somehow tied to the ritual, to the power that had been unleashed. It was her only chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. She pushed open the gates, her heart pounding in her chest as she stepped onto the overgrown path leading to the front doors. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the oppressive silence pressed down on her like a weight. Lena took a deep breath and walked up the steps, the old wood creaking under her feet. She pushed open the door, the darkness inside greeting her like an old friend. The flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing the same decayed interior she had seen before, but this time Lena didn't linger in the foyer. She headed straight for the basement door, the key clutched tightly in her hand. The door creaked open, and Lena descended the stairs, the cold air wrapping around her like a shroud. The basement was just as she had left it. The table in the center, the old medical equipment lining the walls, the small door in the corner barely visible in the darkness. Lena approached the small door, her heart pounding as she slid the key into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing the tiny room she had found before. But this time, there was something different. The air was thicker, heavier, as if something was waiting for her. Lena stepped inside, her flashlight illuminating the small space. The diary was gone, but something else had taken its place. A small wooden box, intricately carved with strange symbols. The box seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light as if it were alive. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she reached out to touch the box. The moment her fingers brushed the surface, a shock of electricity shot through her, and the room seemed to shift around her, the walls closing in, the darkness pressing down. She pulled back, her hand trembling. The box. This was what Mirov had been searching for, what he had used in his rituals. The key, the box, the boy. They were all connected, tied together by a dark power that had been unleashed. Lena knew what she had to do. She had to destroy the box, to break the connection between the boy and the ancient power that was using him. It was the only way to stop the darkness from spreading, from consuming everything. But as she reached for the box again, a voice echoed through the room, low and menacing. "You cannot stop it." Lena froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice was coming from everywhere and nowhere, filling the room with a cold, suffocating dread. It is already too late. The shadows in the room began to move, shifting and twisting, forming into a figure, a tall, dark shape with eyes that glowed like embers in the darkness. "The boy belongs to me," the voice said, the figure stepping closer. "And so do you." Lena's blood ran cold as the figure loomed over her, its presence like a dark cloud suffocating the light. She tried to move, to run, but her feet were rooted to the spot, her body frozen with fear. "You cannot escape," the figure hissed, its voice a cold whisper in her ear. "You are mine." But Lena wasn't ready to give up. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let the darkness win. Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, she reached for the box, her fingers closing around it. The moment she touched it, the darkness exploded around her, the room dissolving into chaos. The figure screamed, a sound of pure rage and fury as the box began to glow, its light growing brighter and brighter. Lena felt the ground shift beneath her feet, the walls collapsing, the ceiling caving in. But she held on, her grip on the box tightening as the light grew, filling the room, pushing back the darkness. And then, with a final, blinding flash, the light exploded and everything went still. Lena gasped, her eyes snapping open. She was lying on the floor, the cold stone beneath her, the air thick with dust. The room was silent, the darkness gone, the figure vanished. She sat up slowly, her body aching, her mind spinning. The box lay beside her, its light extinguished, the carvings dull and lifeless. And then she saw him. The boy with silver hair stood in the center of the room, his back to her, his small frame dwarfed by the shadows. He was as still as a statue, his head bowed, his hands hanging limply at his sides. But Lena could feel the power radiating from him, the dark energy that had been unleashed through him now swirling in the air like a living thing. "Why are you here?" Lena's voice was a whisper, but it carried through the room like a shout. The boy didn't move, didn't acknowledge her. He just stood there, silent, as if waiting for something. "I know what happened," Lena said, stepping closer. "I know what Mirov did to you, to all of you, and I know what he was trying to do, but it doesn't have to end this way." The boy's head tilted slightly as if he were listening, but still, he remained silent. Lena took another step forward, her hands trembling as she held out the box. This is what he used, isn't it? This is what he was trying to use to control you, to control the power. But he failed, didn't he? And now it's been unleashed. For a moment, the boy was still, and then, slowly, he turned to face her. His eyes were different now, darker, swirling with the depth of emotion that took Lena's breath away. There was pain there, yes, and anger, but there was something else, something that looked like hope, or maybe just the memory of it. "He tried to trap us," the boy whispered, his voice soft, but it echoed in the room as if carried on the wind. "He tried to steal our lives, our souls, but he didn't understand the power. He didn't understand that it can't be controlled, only released." Lena's heart ached as she looked at him, this child who had been caught in something so much bigger than himself, something that had twisted his life into a nightmare. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry for what he did to you, but you don't have to let it control you anymore. We can end this together." The boy's eyes flickered with something Lena couldn't quite identify, but he nodded slowly, as if accepting what she was saying. "The box," he said, his gaze fixed on the artifact in her hands. "It's the key. It's the prison he made for us. You have to destroy it." Lena nodded, her resolve hardening. "How? How do I destroy it?" The boy took a step closer, his eyes locked on hers. "The power is bound to it, but it's also bound to us, to me. If you destroy the box, it will break the connection, but it will also destroy me." Lena's breath caught in her throat. "No, there has to be another way." The boy shook his head, a sad smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "There isn't. This is the only way to end it. The darkness has to be released, and it has to be contained. It's the only way to stop it from spreading, from consuming everything." Tears welled in Lena's eyes, but she blinked them back. She couldn't break down now, not when they were so close to ending this nightmare. "I don't want to hurt you," she whispered. "You don't deserve this." The boy reached out, his small hand resting on hers. His touch was cold, but there was a strange warmth in his gaze, a kindness that seemed out of place in this dark, twisted world. "It's okay," he said softly. "You're not hurting me. You're setting me free." Lena's heart ached with the weight of what she was about to do, but she knew there was no other choice. She had to end this for the boy, for the other children, for everyone who had been caught in Mirov's twisted web. She tightened her grip on the box, her hands trembling as she raised it above her head. The room seemed to pulse with energy, the air thick with anticipation, as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for her to make her move. "Do it," the boy whispered, his voice steady, resolute. Lena hesitated for a heartbeat. Then, with a cry that was both pain and release, she brought the box down with all her strength, smashing it against the cold stone floor. The box shattered into 1,000 pieces, and the room exploded with light. The darkness that had been swirling around them was sucked into the light, twisted and contorted as it was drawn into the void where the box had been. The boy let out a soft gasp, his form flickering as the power was pulled from him, leaving behind only the faintest trace of his presence. Lena collapsed to the floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the light faded, leaving behind only the silence. The boy was gone, his small form dissolved into the ether, leaving Lena alone in the darkened room. For a long moment she just sat there, her mind numb, her body exhausted. The weight of what she had done, of what she had lost, pressed down on her, threatening to crush her under its unbearable burden. But then, as the silence settled around her, Lena felt something else, something lighter, freer. The darkness was gone. The power that had been unleashed, the force that had haunted her for so long, was gone. The boy was free, and so were the others. And with that realization came a bittersweet sense of relief. She had done it. She had ended the nightmare. But at what cost? Lena stood slowly, her legs shaking as she made her way out of the basement, out of the orphanage, out into the night. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and clear, the stars twinkling in the sky above her. The world felt different now, lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from its shoulders. But Lena knew that she would carry the burden of this night with her forever. The faces of the children, the boy's final smile, the darkness that had threatened to consume them all. It was all etched into her memory, a scar that would never fully heal. As she walked back to her car, Lena glanced over her shoulder one last time, back at the orphanage that had been the source of so much pain, so much horror. The building stood silent, its windows dark, its secrets finally laid to rest. But as Lena turned away, a faint breeze stirred the leaves at her feet, and for just a moment she thought she heard a soft whisper on the wind. "Thank you." A small, sad smile tugged at the corners of Lena's lips as she climbed into her car, the weight of the past finally lifting from her shoulders. The journey was over, the darkness defeated, but the memories would stay with her, a reminder of the horrors she had faced and the lives she had touched. As she drove away, the stars above her bright and clear, Lena knew that she had done the right thing. She had set them free. But the echoes of their voices, the shadows of their pain would follow her, always just out of sight, just out of reach. And as she disappeared into the night, the orphanage stood silent and still, its dark history buried, its secrets finally at rest. For now,